In this presentation, we will take a look at the banking section of the home page within QuickBooks Pro 2019. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are on the home page, which can be found at the company dropdown and home page. We also have the Open Windows Open, which can be found in the Views tab and Open Windows list. We will be now navigating through the banking section. If you would like to jump to just entering data and starting a new company file and entering new data, you can go down to the section where their videos start with a 6 to do that. Here we're going to be navigating through the system and looking how the system is put together, and the flowcharts are a really good way in order to do that. We've looked at the vendor section, we've looked at the customer section. We're now looking at the banking section. The banking section has a lot of items that are really useful, that are used a lot of times, but doesn't really affect or isn't really placed within a particular flow. They may be items that will relate to what we would think of as mainly the vendor section or the customer section, but they don't always fit there, and therefore QuickBooks put them into the banking section. They're worth looking at because QuickBooks thinks that they're important enough and used enough that we want them on the main page, the home page. For example, the record deposit we looked at in a prior presentation when we considered the customer's flow here, and we saw that the customer flow goes directly to the deposits. So although the banking section is over here and the customer and the record deposits is in the banking section, it's linked here to the customers because we hope that most of the deposits that we make into the system are from customers. So we would think that hopefully most of the deposits are from customers. However, there are going to be some deposits that will not be from customers, and we might have a loan from the bank, for example, or we might be putting money into the system ourselves as the owners. So the first thing we want to look at then will be that record deposits item. And again, why is it in the banking system? Because it doesn't fit directly anywhere else, but we use it all the time. So it fits most directly into the customer's flow chart. We would assume that most deposits that we make into the checking account will be from customers. That's normally the case, but it's not always the case. If we go into the record deposits, we get this pop-up, and those are going to be deposits that went through undeposited funds. Well, I'm not going to discuss this any further now. We looked at that in a prior presentation. So we'll close this back out, and let's just go to a previous deposit. And just be aware that this screen is always going to be the screen that means we're typically going to be depositing to the checking account. That's going to be our main account. If we have more than one cash account, we can pick some other kind of checking account as well. If we only have one main checking account, then this is going to be a form that will drive the deposit to the checking account. The other side, if it came from customers, will be going through undeposited funds, but we can make a deposit screen for any kind of deposit. If we were to get a loan from the bank, we could use the deposit screen, depositing it into the system, recording the other side to be a loan payable. If it was from us, we can record it into the bank. That's what this deposit screen will do, and name the other side, which will be from equity, a customer, an investment. The equity section will be increased as well. So that's going to be this screen. We won't go through the financial statements here. The main ones we've looked at being the customer's deposits, which will increase cash, and it will increase or decrease the undeposited funds account. So let's close this one back out. Also note that if we enter something into the check register, say we go to banking up top and we go to use register, and we'll get in there a different way in just a second, and then go to the check register, checking. We could enter deposits directly into here by entering just a deposit on this side. And even if we do that, QuickBooks will often still make a deposit screen when we go back into it. It'll still create that form of a deposit because that's what QuickBooks thinks of as the driving item that will be used, the driving form, the driving documentation to record deposits into the checking account. So I'm going to close this back out. The other item we have here is a reconciliation. Now, a reconciliation, we typically think of the bank reconciliation. So if we select this item, it's going to go to the checking account, and we've got the next bank reconciliation we need, and we can go through the reconciliation process. The reconciliation process isn't a data entry point. We don't enter data with the reconciliation, but it's us reconciling our books to the bank. Really useful process because that's going to give us an outside check. And so QuickBooks thinks that's so important that they're going to put that, I'm going to close this back out, in the banking section here. So we're not actually recording anything. This isn't us going through the normal recording, but QuickBooks is pretty much saying, hey, we really should be reconciling, because if we can reconcile, that's one internal control that both small companies and large companies can do that helps save a lot of time. And so this is something that will happen every month. We typically reconcile every month for the bank statement, comparing the bank's books to our books. We'll go over that process of reconciliation here. You can find it here. And most of these items that you find here, you can also find in the drop downs as well. And most of the banking items I deal with, the deposit, I use this, but with the reconciliation, I would normally go to the banking drop down and go to the reconcile here. So most of these items that we've looked at, we can also find within these drop downs. I use the home page for some of them and drop downs for others of them, as you'll probably be able to tell after a while. So here's the reconciliation. And then we've got the write checks. So if we just want to write a check, we would use this item here, meaning a write check would do exactly what you would expect it to do. It would decrease cash in the checking account, and it would write a check to whoever we wrote a check for. The only difference between a check and what we might see in the normal register, so if we, for example, if we go to the register again, which I can go to here, which I did last time by going to banking and going to the register. If we go to the check register, which is what some of us are familiar with if we're writing a check and trying to track our cash within the check register, we're remembering that we're going to see, let's take this one for example. We have the check number, we've got the date, we've got who we paid, in this case Verizon, which is a phone company, and then we've got the check amount. And then we might write a memo in the check register saying, hey, we paid the phone bill or something like that. But we need some added data, one added piece of data for QuickBooks, and that is what account should we be putting this to? In this case, it's accounts payable because we're paying off a bill. But if we were paying Verizon directly, then this one would be like the telephone company. So that's the only other piece of information we really need within the check. We need to know who we paid, the vendor. We need to know the amount, and we need to know the other account. So when we record it, then that's what's going to be recorded in terms of the journal entry. The check means that we're writing a check and decreasing cash. The other side of it, so I just scrolled up to find another check up here. So I'm up on January 28th. We paid Edison, which is a utilities company, and we wrote it to the utilities here. So if we double click this item, this little CHK, that'll be the check. If we double click that check, we'll see it in check format. So even if we enter it into our register, it'll be generating a check. And when we generate the check, then we know that it's going to be decreasing the checking account. That's what a check does. So checking account goes down. And the other side we have is going to be going to the expense. So we'll name the expense down here. So every time we write a check, then of course checking account goes down. The other side will be an expense, or it'll be an item that will decrease the items with. And we'll talk more about how that is done when we start to enter data into the system. So that's going to be just a normal check. Now just note that within the checks, we could print checks from the system. And if we were to do that, we would buy pre-numbered checks and actually put them into the printer, and we can print them out. Or we can just enter this data into the system, possibly from the bank statement, and just enter the data into the system from that format and actually write the checks outside of the system. So I'm going to close this back out. We'll close this back out. So that's going to be the check. Now the check register is what we've just been looking at a few times. And that's another way we can enter transactions very quickly. So if we are in a system, anytime we deal with the bank, the checking account, a quick way to enter the data would be not to use the check form, but just go directly to the check register. Or a quick way for us to enter the deposit, if we want to make a deposit, would be not to go to the deposit screen, but just go directly to the check register. This is really useful if we're, say, doing a lot of our bookkeeping from the bank statement. At the end of the month, we got the bank statement. Maybe a lot of our stuff is going on that's electronically done. It's done automatically. Then it would be easier for us to just go directly to the register and enter the data from the bank statement to the register, or check our information from the register. So the register is one area that can help us to enter data more quickly and see what's going on with the checking account. So if we go to the check register, then we'll see all these items as we might be used to seeing in a handwritten type of check register. Now the check register, it could have the checks in it, but don't let that confuse you as if there's only checks that can be in there. We call it a check register because normally it's going to have the checks that will be accounted for. But if we have electronic deposits or something like that, we can also enter that in here. So this is kind of a format of a general ledger. It's the backup, it's the supporting documentation entered by date that will be in the checking account. Notice the balance here is always going to match what's in the checking account. That means anything that has to deal with increasing or decreasing the checking account goes here. That means that we could have, it will be tracked here. So that means we can have a deposit that will be in here, that will be reflected here. We can have checks that will be reflected here. Any electronic deposit we can put in here. Just make sure that we use the check number that is not reflecting a check, but some other type of transaction that's happening. When we make a check in here, it'll still make a form. So even if I entered it directly into here, QuickBooks will make a check with it. When we say pay bills, for example, and we pay bills with checks, then QuickBooks will still generate this within the check register. The check register will reflect those checks that were generated through the pay bills icon that we looked in a prior presentation. When we process payroll, QuickBooks will write a check within the check register related to the payroll that we made. When we make a deposit into the system, QuickBooks will generate a deposit within the system, whether we do it here in the check register or not. This is the supporting documentation for anything that will be affecting the check register. If we double click, for example, on this little deposit, and you can't click anywhere else if you want to see the form, the documentation that QuickBooks is using, you got to click right here where it says, has these little forms. So this is a deposit. If we double click on that, then we see a deposit type form. And this will give you, it doesn't matter if we entered it into the check register or into the deposit, QuickBooks will probably make this form as a supporting document. So if we put it into the check register, QuickBooks would make this form, in other words. If we made this form, QuickBooks would still put it into the check register. Either way, they'll be connected. So if we close this back out, that's going to be the check register. If we close that back out, very useful. We obviously go there a lot. I typically go there with the drop-down, banking, and use register. And the reason I do that is because I'm not always in the home page. So I typically go here when I'm doing something different. When I enter invoices in here, I go here. If I enter bills, I go to the home page. But the register, I might go from anywhere. I might be looking at reports or something. So I typically use the drop downs when I go to that information, this banking information. And then we've got the print checks here. The checks can be printed from the system. So if they're printed in the system, when we enter the checks into the system, we tell QuickBooks, hey, we're going to print the checks later. And QuickBooks will then not assign a check number, and it'll assign the check number as we print the checks. We then printing the checks, putting the checks into the printer, and we can then print the checks. And those pre-numbered checks should line up then to what we have in the system. That's going to be one of our major internal controls. So we could print the checks within the system. Remember, if you do so, we do still need to buy the checks. They will still be pre-numbered checks. And the QuickBooks system will have numbering of the check that will be separate, and they should line up. And that's going to be an internal control we have. The pre-numbered checks that are outside of the system should line up to the numbering system within QuickBooks, and that's going to give us an idea of those numbering systems. And then we've got the enter credit card charges, and we can set up the credit card charges type of payments within QuickBooks as well. So these are going to be some of the major important type of documents that we could use, or type of areas within QuickBooks that QuickBooks thinks is important enough to put into the banking section. So that's important enough to go through some of these items and see what they do. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info.